Hey guys, your video today is going to be done through a walking tour of the science room. Now, what you'll be focusing on today is another event in the civil rights movement, the Freedom Riders. This took place throughout 1961 and was another instance in which civil disobedience helped show that you can get things done through peaceful ways. Now, after the Montgomery bus boycotts and after the Little Rock Nine, the Supreme Court was making decisions about desegregating the South, and the Southern governments were essentially ignoring them altogether, and the U.S. government wasn't really doing much to enforce them. The Freedom Rides was one way that the people decided to take actions into their own hands. They decided to peacefully follow these new rules. Civil disobedience is going to once again show how successful the civil rights movement would become. And I'll come back to you after this video.
By the late 19th century, segregation of blacks and whites had become an entrenched way of life in the South. In December 1960, another Supreme Court ruling declared segregated restrooms, restaurants, and waiting rooms for interstate bus, train, and plane passengers unconstitutional. 5 months later, that law would be severely tested by Freedom Riders. The Freedom Rides were organized by James Farmer, director of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, a civil rights organization rooted in the philosophy of nonviolence. Farmer, who would be arrested with other Freedom Riders, launched the movement to draw attention to the lack of enforcement of recent civil rights court decisions and legislation. As Farmer's volunteers rode into the South, the campaign gained support from civil rights leaders like Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King, Jr. When the riders arrived in Atlanta, King praised them for their nonviolent, direct action, but he warned of trouble ahead. "You'll never make it through Alabama," he predicted. Activist John Lewis, now a congressman from Georgia, was then a 21-year-old divinity student. He was the first of the Freedom Riders to be attacked when he and a fellow white rider tried to enter a whites-only waiting room at a Greyhound terminal in Rock Hill, South Carolina. Traveling deeper into the South, to Mississippi and Alabama, singing spirituals and freedom songs, the riders were met with hostility, arrest, and more violence. One of the most frightening attacks occurred a few miles outside Anniston, Alabama, on May 14, 1961. A Greyhound bus carrying Freedom Riders was forced off the road by a white mob who stoned and firebombed the bus. The passengers barely escaped the burning vehicle. That same day, several of the Freedom Riders arriving at the Trailways bus depot in Birmingham suffered savage and bloody assaults. Among several beaten by the Ku Klux Klan was 61-year-old Walter Bergman, a college professor from Detroit. Undaunted, he urged others to join the cause and strike while the iron is hot. His fellow rider, Reverend B. Elton Cox, an outspoken minister from North Carolina, also remained defiant, saying he preferred death to segregation. Jim Swerg, a 21-year-old studying to be a congregational minister, was the victim of an ambush attack a week later at the Greyhound bus station in Montgomery, Alabama. Screaming, "Nigger lover," the mob pummeled him, fracturing his teeth and injuring his back. Trained in nonviolence, like his co-riders, he never struck back. As the vicious attacks on the Freedom Riders continued, the National Guard was called out. When hundreds of supporters of the Freedom Rides assembled at Montgomery's First Baptist Church with Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, an angry mob gathered outside. The National Guard patrolled the besieged church during the long, tense night. At times, however, Lewis recalled, the guards, with their bayoneted rifles, looked like the enemy. With their presence, the violence was quelled, but hostility awaited the riders as they arrived in Jackson. When black riders tried to enter a white waiting room, or white riders tried to use facilities designated for blacks, local police officers ordered them out. If the riders refused to leave, they were immediately arrested and charged with breach of peace. As the Freedom Riders were taken into custody in Jackson, they did not resist. Some bailed out of jail, but many, in a show of commitment to their cause, refused to be bailed out. The jail, no bail tactic, adopted by scores of those arrested, would burden Mississippi's penal system for months. Here's Martin Luther King, Jr.
Never in the history of this nation have so many people been arrested for the cause of freedom and human dignity.
While hundreds of freedom riders endured hot, dirty prison cells, civil rights leaders appealed to Washington. Attorney General Robert Kennedy had hoped for a quick end to the protests, and especially the violence. Finally, Kennedy pressured the Interstate Commerce Commission, the agency that regulated interstate travel, to issue a new and stronger ruling banning segregated facilities. The ruling went into effect on November 1st, 1961. It would still be many years before segregation would end completely, but the Freedom Riders had won a major battle in the war against racism.
I hope you enjoyed that video from the Smithsonian Magazine. I think that they did a good job at showing you what the Freedom Riders were really all about. I hope you noticed that it was not just African Americans participating in the Freedom Rides, it was largely whites as well. These people worked together peacefully to get done what they thought was right, to follow the laws that were put in place by the Supreme Court and the national government. And as is the case with the Little Rock Nine and the Montgomery bus boycotts, you do face strong opposition that ultimately led to violence in this case. But the Freedom Rides is yet another instance in which peaceful protest successfully helped achieve something for African Americans. It was one more time that Martin Luther King's movement was proving successful despite the violence that they met. That's it for today. We'll talk about this tomorrow, and good luck.